Good morning, everyone. I'm Claude Barfield, a resident scholar here at the American Enterprise Institute, and I'd like to welcome you to our session on negotiating authority, trade authority, where we'll be looking at the division of power between the President and the Congress. I should say before I introduce Senator Lee, I'd like to make a brief point that, and I won't speak for my panelist colleagues, Stoffar and Lincecum, there is a kind of irony in the situation as it's emerged in terms of trade policy, at least from my ancient perspective. I guess I spent most of my career dealing with trade, suspicious of Congress. The President was the place that you, as a free trader, you would look for succor and defense. And the Congress was ripe for interest groups. You'd always have the steel industry or the aluminum industry or somebody coming to try to deflect U.S. policy in a trade protection direction. And so this movement, which we came later to, obviously, since the 1930s at least, of the Congress, which has full constitutional authority in our system over trade, of giving power more and more to the President, was one that nobody really, most people, at least on the side of the free trade side, as it were, applauded. Not thinking about you could have a time when an administration came to office in which the precepts and the ideas about open markets and trade liberalization might be called into question. And really that's what we're here about this morning. And I think that Senator Lee will speak for himself. That is indeed what his bill is about, to retake to some degree back to the Congress the constitutional power that it has had from the beginning of the Republic. The way we proceed, Senator Lee will speak. Depending on time, he may or may not have a chance to take a question or two, and then we'll move just directly to the panel, which we will not have formal presentations. It'll be just a conversation among the three of us, and I'll introduce the other panelists at that time. Senator Lee was elected to the Senate in 1910, and he now serves on the Senate Commerce Committee and the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee. He has also chaired this Republican Steering Committee. Before he came to the Senate, he practiced law, and after law school, he had clerked for Associate Judge Justice Samuel Eliotto. He has become, in a fundamental sense, really the kind of Senate, the constitutional conscience of the Senate. And so without more, I'd like to introduce Senator Lee. Thank you very much for coming.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be with you. Anytime I hear someone introduce me as a member of the Senate, as a member of Congress, I always get kind of nervous. It's these days, being introduced as a member of Congress or as a politician generally is sort of like being introduced as a carnival ride operator, but without all the glory. My dad used to say, and my dad was a lawyer also, and he used to swap lawyer jokes. He had this little plaque in his office that said, "Yes, I'm a lawyer, but please don't tell my mother because she thinks I play the piano in a bordello." And politicians are somehow underneath the food chain, lower in the food chain even than lawyers. And so he also used to tell a joke about how it's funny how we use the reverse of the word that should be used in reference to certain people. If you know someone who is overweight, you might call them slim. If you know someone who is bald, you might call him curly. And if you know a politician, you call him the honorable. And so it works out somehow. It is an honor to be here this morning. I love this building and was elated to learn that it is the former home of Andrew Mellon. He lived here while he was, I'm sure everybody here knows this, while he was serving as Secretary of the Treasury. And there's so much about this city and about this country that is historic, and it's an honor to be here. In a way, it's a wonder that any of us are here, choosing to spend time early on a Thursday morning at a think tank event to talk about trade policy. 5 months ago, I wonder whether any of us thought we'd be here talking about this particular issue today, even with the promise of free food at a beautiful building like this one. But President Trump's election has, as the saying goes, made trade policy great again. It has had that effect. The election, the events that led to it, and the events that have followed it have brought this to the forefront of our national discussion once again. Not just in Washington, but really around the country. And so here we are. I see it as a good thing. Now, in the second half of the 20th century, there was a bipartisan consensus of sorts that emerged in Washington. And this was a consensus that involved people at both ends of the political spectrum agreeing on certain fundamental long-term objectives. Objectives that concluded that America's trade policy ought to be the pursuit of lower trade barriers at home and lower trade barriers abroad. The lower these barriers would be, the better off we would all be. For decades, this consensus determined the course of America's trade policy, and it set parameters for trade debates. But over time, those parameters started to grow increasingly narrow, and they became rigid. Eventually, defending that very conventional wisdom became less about winning a debate and more about avoiding one. Departing from or challenging that bipartisan consensus came to be seen as a sort of taboo. It's just not something you did. Adherence to conventional wisdom was enforced a little bit like political correctness is enforced on some college campuses through speech codes. Just look at how the campaigns of Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump, apparently I've triggered some sort of alarm. Maybe I've said something wrong. Arthur didn't like what I was saying. Arthur's always watching, even when he's not physically present in the room. Just look at how the campaigns of Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump and their iconoclastic positions on trade were openly ridiculed, mocked, and disparaged by the Washington establishment. And we all know how that turned out. Their skepticism toward our trade status quo might have been the butt of jokes around town here in Washington, but it was warmly embraced on the campaign trail by large swaths of the American electorate. A whole lot of people found this message one that resonated with them. This isn't because the American people don't understand the benefits of liberalized trade as well as policymakers in Washington, but rather because they understand the potential downsides of trade policy perhaps better than we do. And just as importantly, they had grown distrustful and disdainful of the political class that seemed perfectly happy ignoring their concerns and dismissing any objections to the status quo as either illiberal or otherwise illegitimate. Some things in politics are, in fact, final. As Calvin Coolidge, one of my favorite presidents, once said in a tribute that he was giving to the Declaration of Independence, quote, "If all men are created equal, that is final. If they are endowed by inalienable rights, that is final. If governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed, that is final. No advance, no progress can be made beyond these propositions," close quote. But a nation's trade policy, well, there's nothing final about that. Trade policy evolves. It's constantly in motion. It never really stops. It never reaches its angle of repose. It's just always transforming from one phase into the next. Indeed, President Coolidge himself was a famous, or one might say infamous, champion of tariffs. So I think Silent Cal would be glad, as I am, that last year's presidential campaign helped reopen the debate over trade policy in this country. But how much actual debate have we seen since the election? Not much, not a whole lot. In fact, very, very little trade policy has actually come to the forefront since November's election and since the inauguration in January. Sure, we're here this morning, we're having this conversation, a few dozen of us, but we might not have been even having this discussion if the election had turned out differently. And if trade scholars like Gary and Claude are in higher demand than usual. That's perhaps one of the symptoms of what we've seen politically over the last few months. But on Capitol Hill, the silence is deafening, the silence on this area in particular. Part of this has to do with the fact that we've got notoriously risk-averse politicians taking a wait-and-see approach to just about everything, but especially in this area. And we also have a new, somewhat unpredictable president. But there is, of course, more to it than just these factors. The real reason members of Congress have been reluctant to engage in the trade debate that last year's election helped to resurrect is that as an institution, Congress no longer sees itself as the lead author of our nation's trade policies. As a brief tangent here, I'd note that Congress often finds itself in this position, where it no longer sees itself as the lead author in all kinds of policies. Congress sometimes chooses to pass the buck. And to a large extent, it isn't, especially where President Trump has focused most of this attention, protecting against unfair practices by our trading partners. Under current law, the president has ample authority to unilaterally shape and change our nation's trade policies if his administration determines that the behavior of a particular trade partner is either unfair or unreasonable or otherwise might be likely to cause us problems. Without so much as tweeting at Congress, much less moving legislation through Congress, the president can respond to such behaviors by 1, raising tariffs, 2, withdrawing from trade agreements with other nations, or 3, using any number of non-tariff mechanisms to restrict imports coming from outside the country into the country. Now, some of these legal mechanisms available to the president and his cabinet are limited in their scope and limited in their effect, while others are pretty broad and really far-reaching. But they all have in common one thing, which is that they give the executive branch, and in some cases, even the president himself, virtually unrestrained authority to make, change, and remake our nation's trade policy, all within the executive branch, all without involving the branch of the federal government whose job it is to make policy, to change law. You don't need a law degree to see the problem here. In fact, I'm convinced that in many circumstances, a law degree is actually an affirmative impediment to understanding some of the constitutional problems associated with this. For some reason, once you go to law school, that empties out the part of your brain that is supposed to be alerted whenever you see one branch of government making and enforcing the same set of laws. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution clearly gives Congress the power to do a couple of things that matter here. First of all, Congress has the power to make law. Article 1, Section 1, Clause 1 says that all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress, which shall consist of a Senate and a House of Representatives. And then in Article 1, Section 8, we've got a couple of clauses that deal specifically with this area. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1 gives Congress the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, and imposts. And Clause 3 gives Congress the power to regulate commerce between the states, with foreign nations, and with the Indian tribes. Of course, as the nation's top diplomat and as the commander-in-chief also, the president has a very legitimate constitutional role to play as well. I don't mean to diminish in any way the office of President of the United States or to suggest that the president plays no role. The framers knew that the executive branch, united under the direction of a single individual, which they went out of their way to make sure happened, would possess unique attributes that are vital to the successful negotiation of international agreements, including trade agreements. Attributes like decision, activity, secrecy, and dispatch, as Alexander Hamilton quite eloquently described it. But the framers also knew that our nation's trade policy was important enough that it should be controlled by those government officials who are closest to the people and who are accountable to the people most directly and at the most regular intervals. That is, those who are elected to serve in the United States Congress. This stringent system of very regular accountability is the linchpin of America's experiment in self-government. It's what truly distinguishes ours as a government that is of, by, and for the people from one that is not. It's also one that is extremely inconvenient for elected officials, which is one reason why Congress has spent much of the past century delegating away many of its lawmaking powers, just handing those powers over to the executive branch, saying, here you go, here are the keys to the kingdom, manage them well. This has happened in just about every area, but trade is no exception. For the first 150 years or so of American history, of our history under our constitutional system of government, our trade policy making process looked basically like what the Constitution contemplates. Congress was in charge of determining the nation's trade policies, primarily by setting tariff rates on imported products, while the president and his cabinet took the lead in negotiating individual trade deals. As intended, this arrangement fostered vigorous debate about trade in Congress and in the public square, and it ensured that the nation's trade policy reflected the will of the American people, because again, those who were setting that policy were subject to very regular elections in the House of Representatives every 2 years. But over time, these hallmarks of a Republican government seemed to be seen not as virtues, but as impediments, not as features, but as bugs in the system. And by the early 1930s, Congress had decided to create a new arrangement, one more conducive to the career prospects of its members, one that depended less on taking responsibility than it did on ducking responsibility. Congress started to adopt a duck and dodge strategy relative to setting policy in all sorts of areas, including and especially trade. Under immense pressure from domestic producers seeking relief from competition abroad and collapsing markets here within the United States, Congress passed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930. This raised tariffs to unprecedented heights and helped strangle an economy that was already suffocating under the weight of the Great Depression. It didn't take long for the imprudence of Smoot-Hawley to become apparent to just about everyone, from members of Congress who authored the bill to the tariff collectors who were scattered across the country and to some extent throughout the world who were enforcing it on behalf of the United States government. As it turns out, I have some connection to this. The Smoot in Smoot-Hawley was a senator named Reed Smoot, who was the lead author of the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. He was my predecessor. And I have another connection to Smoot-Hawley in the fact that my maternal grandfather, to whom I was very close growing up, was a T-man. He was a tariff collector. The T-men were the closest thing to an FBI agent back in the day before we had a sprawling police state within the federal government. And his job included, among other things, collecting tariffs under the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. He did this around the world and within the United States in various postings that he had. If there's one thing that I learned from my grandfather, and there were many, those things certainly included the risks of setting off a trade war. He lamented to me, even through his very final years, how much he regretted having been part of an operation that enforced the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, which he blamed as a contributing factor, as a precipitating force in the creation of the global depression that occurred in the 1930s, about the time he started his job with the U.S. Department of Treasury. So my grandfather drilled into me from the time I was very young, you should always avoid policies that embody trade protectionism. Trade protectionism is bad. Trade protectionism is dangerous. It kills economies. Ultimately, it has the potential to kill people. So watch out for that, and don't ever make the same mistake that Reed Smoot made in thinking that trade protectionism is a good idea. It might look like fun from afar, but when you get close to it, bad things happen when you do it. But mustering the political will to repeal Smoot-Hawley, once it took effect and once people started to realize that it had some real dark sides to it, or to reduce tariffs, proved to be far more difficult than simply recognizing the problems associated with it. It was too difficult, in fact, for Congress. Doubtful of its own ability to stand up to special interest protectionist pressure, Congress gave up trying and instead delegated to the president the power to reduce tariffs unilaterally under the reciprocal trade agreements of 1934. I'll note here that this is not unlike what happens in some other politically volatile contexts. Just a few years ago, when I was new to the Senate, you had a number of senators who, approaching a debt ceiling increase deadline, decided that perhaps they should find a way to delegate to the president the power unilaterally to raise the debt ceiling. That way it wouldn't be Congress doing it. Somehow if we say Timmy's going to do it, then once Timmy does it, Congress can duck and dodge all responsibility and political accountability that goes along with making whatever controversial decision is about to be made. This is what happened in trade policy. This was a landmark abdication of trade power. Never before had Congress granted the executive branch such expansive tariff modification authority. And it was motivated largely by the self-preservation instincts of members of Congress, who were willing to give up their constitutional powers in exchange for a policy outcome that they couldn't achieve themselves. As one historian put it, commenting on this experiment, on this period in history in which all this power was transferred to the executive branch, quote, "No longer did Congress give priority to protecting American industry. Instead, its members would give priority to protecting themselves from the direct, one-sided pressure from producer interests that had led them to make bad trade law. What was required was a system that made the buck stop somewhere else," close quote. The Act of 1934 was the foundation for that new system, a system that is still with us today, a system in which the buck stops ultimately with the president and not with Congress or any member of Congress. But while Congress may have not wanted to be in the driver's seat relative to trade policy, it didn't exactly want to be irrelevant either. It wanted still to keep a foot in the door, some way of grabbing the steering wheel before the car went off the cliff, if you will. So under the 1934 Act, the legislative branch retained a few important checks on the president's new powers. For instance, while the president had the authority to set tariff rates and to implement them by proclamation, it was up to Congress to determine the range of acceptable tariff levels that would guide and constrain the president's negotiations. And by making the president's authority limited in duration, every few years, Congress had the chance to decide whether it wanted to reauthorize these same trade powers that it had just delegated to the executive branch. This sharing of trade authority between the executive and legislative branches, established in 1934, became the cornerstone of the modern trade policy-making process and was further cemented in the next major phase of trade reform that occurred in the 1970s. The Trade Act of 1974 created the fast-track process, what we now call Trade Promotion Authority, most recently renewed in 2015, as a way to strengthen the partnership between the President and the Congress. Similar to the system that was established in the 34 Act, the fast-track process empowered the President to engage in international negotiations with flexibility and credibility, while also requiring input from Congress. But there's one idea, there's one area within trade policy where irrelevancy apparently was Congress's goal, not just a byproduct, but Congress's actual objective. Throughout the 20th century and into the 21st, when it comes to protecting against unfair practices by our trading partners, Congress has consistently delegated vast powers to the executive branch, deliberately retaining little to no meaningful oversight or even involvement. For instance, in Section 123 of the Trade Act of 1974, in that law, Congress gives the president broad authority to adjust tariffs unilaterally in some circumstances. The same is true of Section 203 of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act of 1977, which gives the president power to freeze foreign assets during times of national emergency. Likewise, there's Section 125 of the 1974 Act, which gives the president termination and withdrawal authority over U.S. trade agreements. There's also Section 301 of the 74 Act, which delegates to the president expansive power to retaliate against foreign governments' import restrictions, insofar as they unfairly affect U.S. commerce. Unlike similar grants of authority in some other trade laws, in its original form, the 1974 Act actually contained a congressional veto procedure in Section 302 that allowed Congress to restrict the president's use of retaliatory action. You see, this became a favorite tool of Congress over the course of about 50 years, starting in the 1930s and running through the mid-1980s, when the Supreme Court of the United States, in a case called INS v. Chadha, declared the legislative veto process unconstitutional, saying that it violated the presentment clause of Article 1, Section 7 of the Constitution. What the court said in Chadha, in effect, was that the legislative bell has to be rung in a particular order, in a particular way. In order to pass new legislation, you have to have bicameralism, meaning passage of a particular policy in identical form in the House and in the Senate, followed by presentment to the president. Without bicameral passage and presentment to the president, then you couldn't have the legislative bell rung. But once the legislative bell was rung, in order to ring it again, in order to modify the original ringing, you couldn't just send it back to Congress and have Congress undo it or unring it. You had to run it through the entire cycle again with bicameral passage and presentment to the president. In fact, if you look at the committee records of the 1974 Act, you'll see that the version of the bill passed by the House of Representatives would have allowed Congress, under the law at the time and under the law that would remain in effect for some time thereafter, to veto any actions taken by the president under Section 301. But the Senate Finance Committee feared that this would give too much power to Congress, so the final legislation included a watered-down version of the House-proposed legislative veto provision. So even with the legislative veto provision intact, even while Congress was still delegating most of its power off to the executive branch, Congress still wanted to limit its power even further, as the Senate legislative history reveals. In the end, this mid-1970s renaissance of congressional prerogatives was short-lived. By the end of the decade, the limited congressional veto mechanism created in Section 302 of the 1974 Act had been stripped from the law. So they stripped that one out, even before provisions like that throughout the U.S. Code were declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, leaving the president with the power to impose higher tariffs on a trading partner via the U.S. Trade Representative if, quote, an act, policy, or practice of a foreign government is unreasonable or discriminatory and burdens or restricts U.S. commerce, close quote. It's not exactly narrow language. I mean, the president could, in almost any circumstance, decide to invoke that authority. And with that authority being invoked, we could have a major, major change in U.S. trade policy, all without the legislative bill ever having been rung. This is what's so ironic about this whole process, what's so odd and perplexing about the Supreme Court's ruling in INS v. Chadha, is that even though Congress, after Chadha, is no longer able to exercise the legislative veto power, you still have a subsequent ringing of the legislative bell that occurs entirely within the executive branch, without any subsequent involvement by the legislative branch, much less by full-blown bicameral passage and presentment to the president. And for the last 40 years, this unilateral authority has remained essentially unchanged and essentially unchallenged, which brings us back to President Trump, his heterodox trade platform, and the tight-lipped response that we've seen from Congress. Clearly, When President Trump says that he has the authority to raise tariffs on China, renegotiate or withdraw from NAFTA, or retaliate against foreign governments that violate our trade agreements, he's standing on solid ground. A lot of people who are watching and paying close attention, and who do routinely pay close attention to those things, when they heard then candidate Trump speak on the campaign trail, they might well have dismissed some of that rhetoric as hyperbole, as something that's maybe wishful thinking about an aspiring president. But it's not. This is reflected in law. He was well advised on the campaign trail when he said that that's what he would do. He wasn't speaking of he himself with his administration and assistance from Congress. He was talking about power that the President of the United States has and can exercise unilaterally. In fact, there are so many possible statutory authorities from which a president can choose, some of which stretch back 100 years. It's not even clear which statute the administration would use to pursue any particular policy or goal. But the bottom line is that the president has ample legal tools at his disposal to implement much of his trade policy platform without any input from Congress whatsoever. That's what the law says. So we have to ask ourselves, is that a good thing? It is a good thing that Congress is involved, or is it rather? Is it in fact a good thing that Congress is involved only in lowering of trade barriers, while the president has unilateral power to raise trade barriers? Is that okay? We have to ask ourselves that question from time to time. Now, if you believe in the Constitution, if you believe in the American experiment in self-government and the obligations of a government that derives all of its just powers from the consent of the governed, I think the answer to that question has to be no. Not just in trade policy, but in any area that's important, in any area of policy at all. But I would think especially in trade policy. That's why I recently introduced a bill called the Global Trade Accountability Act that would help Congress restore its authority over trade policy. And when I say its authority, I don't mean this in the sense of Congress jealously guarding something just for the sake of enhancing its own power, and with that power, the vanity of its own members. I mean the authority that properly belongs to the people who are the sovereigns in our constitutional republic, and the people whose lawmaking power has been channeled through the Constitution to the people's elected representatives in the House and in the Senate, whose job it is to make law. Congress is currently involved in facilitating lower trade barriers, and this bill would allow Congress to reclaim some authority in raising trade barriers also, by subjecting those presidential trade-related actions to a congressional approval process. The premise behind the bill is simple. The role of Congress is not to selectively engage in policymaking based on what's politically convenient at the moment, or based on what any particular member deems likely to facilitate that member's likelihood of achieving perpetual re-election. The Constitution is not an a la carte menu. It's an instrument to secure the social compact between the citizens and the government of the United States. But when Congress pretends otherwise, cherry-picking when and when not to exercise its constitutional powers, it produces bad policy outcomes, and it undermines the mutual trust on which our entire system of government ultimately depends. Indeed, it's precisely this kind of evasion of responsibility that has led us to an unhappy moment in which we find ourselves today. The American people are increasingly dissatisfied with the policy status quo in Washington. And yet, too often the response from members of Congress is to pass the buck along to the president, acting as if the only entity that can fix any of our most challenging policy problems in Washington and in America is the executive branch, is the President of the United States himself. But the American people are generally not fooled by this sidestepping and blame shifting. They see it for what it is. another reason not to trust or respect their elected representatives in Washington. As I see it, earning back the people's trust should be Congress's #1 priority in everything we do in the coming years, and that's exactly the goal of the Global Trade Accountability Act. Here's how it works in a nutshell. The bill would amend current law to require congressional approval for certain executive branch actions on trade, actions that include increasing tariffs, duties, and tariff rate quotas. This process would work just like the fast-track process that the Trade Act of 1974 created, to facilitate congressional approval of trade agreements that lower trade barriers. And it would affect multiple trade laws currently on the books, including some of the laws I've already mentioned, like the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930, the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, and the Trade Act of 1974. If you think about it, this is really quite a modest reform. If the bill were signed into law tomorrow, the president would still lead the United States' response to unfair trade practices by foreign governments. But before any of the retaliatory actions covered by the bill could take effect, the president would need to secure a joint resolution of approval from both the House and the Senate. And in order for that resolution to take effect and have a legally operative impact, it would have to be signed into law by the president. You see, that's what distinguishes this mechanism from an unconstitutional legislative veto, is that it switches the polarity, switches the presumption. It's not that Congress can invalidate an act taken by the president. It's that an act taken by the president has to be run through Congress and come back full circle to the president and be signed into law by the president as contemplated by Article 1, Section 7. If the executive branch were to determine that a trade remedy is necessary to address a national emergency or protect against a threat to our national security, under the bill, the president would have a 90-day window in which he could act unilaterally without receiving any kind of congressional approval. In essence, this bill is about deharmonizing the current disparity between the way Congress treats presidential actions that lower trade barriers versus those presidential actions that raise trade barriers. If Congress is going to be involved in the former, as I think it should be, then it should also be involved in the latter. I see no reason to favor one and disfavor the other. In other words, if you make raising trade barriers far easier than you do lowering trade barriers, then that's going to end up having an impact on your trade policy. The bill deals only with the distribution of power and institutional arrangements that should, according to the Constitution, obtain in the arena of trade policy. It says nothing about the kind of trade policy we should pursue. In this respect, it is trade policy agnostic. This is about the formula and not the precise form, certainly not the substantive policy. But to support this legislation, you don't have to hold a particular view on the ideal trade policy for America. You just have to support the Constitution and the reason its authors put Congress in the driver's seat of all federal policymaking, including this one. In other words, if this bill were signed into law tomorrow, Congress could choose a protectionist trade policy, or it could choose an open borders trade policy, or something in between. The point is that more than today, it would be up to Congress to choose what kind of trade policy we have in the United States of America. And even before that, it would be up to Congress to have a real debate about what kind of trade policy we ought to have in this country. This debate is long overdue, and it's sorely needed. If last year's election taught us anything about what a large bipartisan majority of voters is fed up with, is they're fed up with a shallow contest of political slogans that has, for far too long, masqueraded as a reasoned, conscious discussion about trade policy. The American people know that today's trade status quo has benefits and drawbacks that confound the conventional free trade versus protectionist dichotomy. And they don't think it's too much to ask for their elected representatives to acknowledge both. And they know that when the power to make policy is held by officials who can be fired by the voters at very regular intervals, there's a better chance that those policies will reflect their interests and their priorities. This is what my bill is all about: putting Congress, and by extension, the American people, back in control of our nation's trade policies. The purpose of our trade policy, just like every other government policy, is not to benefit the global economy or the international community, nor to satisfy the dictates of an economic theory or a particular political ideology. No, the purpose is to secure the rights and serve the interests of the American people, not just as consumers, but as workers and as citizens. That may not be the way that we're used to thinking in Washington, because it hasn't been the way we've become accustomed to thinking in Washington for many, many decades, for the better part of a century, in fact. But that's the point. That's precisely the point. So I'm here this morning not just to start a debate about trade policy, but to invite each of you to join me in doing so. Thank you very much.
I know you're pressed for time, and I was told one question, and I'm just going to expedite things, ask that question. What is the chances of your bill passing? I guess and correct me if I'm wrong, there hasn't been a groundswell of support. The rest of the Congress, your fellow senators or in the House, don't seem to have stepped up to this, and they don't seem to be as worried. I mean, if I look at the politics, you know, the Democratic left really is happy with what President Trump is saying he might do, and then you've got people around Trump themselves who would like to keep that presidential power without being thwarted by Congress. So what is the possibility of something like of Congress actually moving?
I used to hear athletes say that they never knew they had a particular muscle until they pulled it in an athletic event. And I think a lot of people aren't aware of certain laws we have on the books, and maybe won't be aware of the need to revisit those laws until such time as they've been pulled, until such time as something has been exercised. Now, I don't think most people, even most people who focus on things like trade policy, are terribly aware of how much unilateral power the executive branch, the president himself, has. But I think we're likely to see sometime in the next few years, maybe during this presidential administration, maybe sometime after, there's going to be someone who exercises that much more aggressively than what we've seen in recent years, or even talks seriously about doing it. When either of those two things happens, I think it'll help accelerate this debate. Now, you're right. I don't see a lot of immediate appetite to pass this bill right away. I wish I did see that, but it's time for us to start moving in that direction. I want to be ready so that when people do become aware of this, we can make the case to the American people. And I think if a president were to come along, and I want to be clear, I started working on this bill and on this project before I even knew who our president was going to be. In fact, we identified the area as one of concern that we wanted to look into before we even knew who our Republican nominee would be. So this is not about this particular president, but at some point, this president or a subsequent one is going to start getting aggressive with this stuff. And when that happens, I think the opportunity will be right. Doesn't mean it'll be easy to pass it, but I do think voters are going to start to demand more accountability of their members of Congress. It's become a little bit too obvious. I mean, after 80 or so years of this business of passing the buck along to the president, let's give the power to the president to do everything that's unpopular or that's controversial or that might subject us as members of Congress to criticism. Voters are starting to wake up to that, and they're starting to realize that we shouldn't get away with it.
Thank you very much, Senator.
Thank you.
We're going to move right to the panel.
speech.
It was. Well, that was a good kickoff for us, and let me introduce our panelists. And I would say that for this, I mean, everybody would probably say this when they're for their panelists, but in this case, it's really true. I can't imagine two better people to discuss the very questions that the senator raised and others than Gary Hofbauer and Scott Lincecum. Gary Hofbauer, as many of you know, is a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute. Before that, he held chairs at the Council of Foreign Relations and Georgetown University. Scott Lincecum is an adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute. I didn't say, are you affiliated formally with White and Case?
Yeah, I'm a practicing attorney at White and Case.
I thought so, but it's not in my bio, but didn't want to leave it out. So he is also a visiting lecturer at the University of Duke Law School. Both of these gentlemen have written, I think, really excellent analyses of the issues we're talking today. I think Gary kind of got first off the mark back in the fall. And then more recently, Scott and his colleagues at White and Case have done an extended legal analysis of the kinds of questions that we've been dealing with today in terms of presidential authority. Before I know, we are pressed for time, but I told the panelists that we postponed this for about 3 weeks, and that's given us a little bit more time to take a look at the evolving trade policy, potential trade policy of the Trump administration. And so I'd like to before we talk about what authority the president has, I'd like to ask them to give a brief analysis from their perspective of where the administration is going. I guess we'll start this off by saying that I think in this case we disagree a bit. And just quickly, I have taken a darker view, actually. I start in terms of the Trump administration with the thought, believe what they're saying. And if you look at what the Trump administration and his advisors have said since the fall, since the election, and before the election, after the election, I think they're going to carry through with some of the things that they're talking about. I think they really believe that they can do something about the trade deficit through trade policy. I think they do believe that the rest of the world is trading unfairly and we are not, and that we should invoke some of the actions that the senator talked about. And I think they will follow through in terms of renegotiating deals down the line, starting with NAFTA. And so that I think that there's going to be a fairly hard nose, and I know we've had these titillating stories about the divisions in this administration. I'm sure there are. Between the so-called internationalists and the economic nationalists. Mm-hmm. My view is that to date, the economic nationalists have won. And I would just take as an example, just briefly, what happened at the G20. We had the Secretary of the Treasury, who is supposed to be the leader of the internationalist group, or one of them, towing the line, taking a hard line, and for the first time in a decade, the United States, because it's the first time it was on the agenda a decade ago, the United States refused to sign a hortatory statement, actually, just a hortatory statement, no teeth in it, that we would oppose all forms of protection. So I think that in terms of the senator's point, I think that you will find at some point the Trump administration pulling the trigger on some of this. So that's my view of it. Let's turn to Gary and then to Scott.
Well, thanks very much, Claude, for organizing this, and I really like to hear from Senator Lee because he's exactly on the mark. Now, what you said about the darker side has got to make my friend Ralph Carter over here pretty nervous, because the darker side, that is the pulling the trigger, has got to be bad for the United States and the world economy. I will say this, the Trump administration has basically stopped pro-liberalization movement in the world economy. And just this morning, I got from Simon Evanet over at St. Gallen University a nice little map of what's happened since the U.S. first went for Buy America under the Obama administration. And he's got a nice map of how other countries went for their Buy Local. And of course, we know that President Trump not only wants to buy America, but he wants to hire Americans and basically only Americans. So the spirit of localization is very strong, and the spirit of no new trade agreements that mean much is pretty strong as well. However, on this, so he stopped kind of forward motion, but has he gone to the point that Ralph doesn't get any sleep? Well, not quite, because the other thing that came up this morning was this draft letter from the acting U.S. trade representative to the Congress on initiating NAFTA negotiations, and this is now on the website, so you can get this. Inside U.S. Trade has the whole draft. Well, it's got a lot of words. You know, it goes on for 8 or 9 pages, 8 pages, but it's very soft in terms of what they want, and it respects the Congress. So it isn't the trigger that's going to alert the Congress that it gave away all these powers the way Senator Lee said. This is a very respectful letter, and in fact it reads kind of like the letter that started off the TPP negotiations way back when, and it goes through all the issues that we want to cover. The most aggressive part I found was on page 5 on government procurement. Of course, he wants to ensure, the USTR wants to ensure that government procurement is conducted in a manner that is consistent with U.S. law and administration's policy on domestic procurement preferences. That's Buy America right there. And then the next bullet is seek to open, this is great, seek to expand market access opportunities for U.S. goods, et cetera, in the government procurement of other countries. I love it. But apart from that, it's a pretty modest kind of initiation. So I'm still of the view that the Trump administration's bark is worse than its bite.
Yeah, and I would tend to agree. But first of all, thanks much for having me. I'm really thrilled to be here, and I agree that what Senator Lee is trying to do, at least in starting the conversation, is really important. And also thanks to Gary for kicking it off with his excellent paper on kind of all of the dirty little secrets of American trade law buried in there, some that we trade lawyers like me didn't even know about. So I think that's great, or actually horrible, but anyway. To your original question, I think that we have a distinction between rhetoric and substance. And on the rhetoric side, yes, we're hearing a lot of economic nationalism. We're hearing things that kind of toe-curling tweets and speeches and statements, and the G20, again, being one of those. But that's really a rhetorical issue. On substance, we're not so far seeing the implementation of a dramatic retrenchment, economic isolationism, economic nationalism by the Trump administration. Now, look, we're only 2+ months in. It might feel like 2 years, but we're only 2 months in. We still don't have a USTR in place. There is plenty of time for what I'm saying right this second to be proven utterly wrong. But right at the moment, another good example would be USTR's original statement of Trump trade policy that came out a few weeks ago. Now, this had some pretty stern wording, and it had a few things related to the WTO's supremacy or U.S. sovereignty or the exercise of United States law and its relationship with adverse dispute settlement decisions. But at the end of the day, if you take out all the harsh rhetoric, a lot of what was in that document was stuff like things that I and Gary and Claude have been saying for years, that look, there isn't a direct sovereignty issue under U.S. law with American trade agreements because they require a voluntary acquiescence or an act of Congress and so forth. So if you look at the substance, so far we really haven't seen it. And then I would add, if you look at the staffing. Now, of course, there are people in the White House itself that might give us all some pause and some worry, some
that starts with the president.
Yes, indigestion. That's very true. But at the same time, if you look at the people who are now beginning to populate the administration, the people who will be doing the day-to-day implementation of trade policy, including Stephen Vaughn, who wrote this document right here, these are accomplished trade lawyers. Now, they are not kind of just hardcore ideological economic nationalists. Now, do I agree with some of the things that they will probably do or that they're advocating? No, I'm more of a free trade guy, of course, and typically take the other side in trade litigation. But this is still well within the policy mainstream. We are not going into the dark reaches, into the corners of U.S. trade law so far, the things that Senator Lee is trying to pull back, or the areas that simply there is no precedent and that can, again, keep us all up late at night.
Okay, well, I hope you guys are right. I'm still, remember, one of the things that triggered me to write about this a couple of weeks ago was a piece that some of you may have seen in the Financial Times when they broke the story about, a very brief story, the weekend Financial Times, in which they talked about a trade war. And a part of that was Mr. Navarro, who's become notorious, and it was out front at the time because nobody else was around, so he was speaking, and they went through this details of a meeting, a furious meeting, as they called it, in the White House, and everybody in the room was dumping all over Navarro, but there was a throwaway line at the end of that piece.
Yeah, right.
But the president seemed to side with Navarro. And then they left it just at that. So I don't want, this is not what we're supposed to talk about this morning, but let's go on to other things. And go back to the questions of the laws that we were talking about and the potential action by the administration. Scott's paper, I think I'm characterizing this correctly, basically argues that a lot of the administration will end up not using or not likely to use anything beyond traditional anti-dumping and CVD. I want you to talk a little bit more about that, because I would say as a footnote, I don't want to read too much because this was a short speech. The senator seemed to think that there was more authority there that could be used, and that maybe he was trying to make a point for his legislation, which I would do too if I were he, but that, the president's got the authority. There's nobody going to check him if he goes into some of these laws. But first, let's talk about the theme of your piece is all the way through is, yes, we've got all these draconian things you could do, but probably not likely he's going to do it.
Right, and that again gets, I think, back to kind of theory and practice. So being a practicing trade lawyer, you first, of course, start with the words of the statute, but then you have to consider how those words are in the context of our greater legal system, whether there is any precedent involved, whether there is any analogous precedent. Then, of course, you have to consider what would happen realistically if the president were to dig some of these old, dusty trade provisions out and start using them. What would happen first, of course, to the markets? Right now, we've had this Trump trade, that we have a Dow that's doing pretty well. What would happen if the president all of a sudden dug out, for example, the Section 338 of Tariff Act of 1930 that's never been used? Yeah. Includes this really broad language. There are no regulations. In fact, the law itself contemplates an entirely different administrative structure than we now have with a USTR and so forth. So what would happen just to the markets? Or how would this work with our modern trade policy formulation, whether it be of course, USTR or the Department of the Treasury, our interagency committees and so forth? Well, what would happen with domestic litigation? Would we see who would sue to stop these laws, and would the courts consider those suits, or would they simply say that's a political question that they won't touch? What would happen at the WTO? Of course, we would see suits. What would happen under our trade agreements? So it's not that we didn't disagree at all with the theoretical problems that exist in the statutes themselves, but we instead stepped a little bit back and simply said, well, what are the ramifications of actually doing this? What are the practical aspects? And I think one of the best examples was that, yes, the president retains this very ambiguous withdrawal authority to withdraw the United States from our trade agreements. And in some cases, under the implementing acts of our trade agreements, it would appear that would cause the act to terminate automatically. But there is a Supreme Court case out there related to the line item veto that is similar to what Senator Lee was talking about with bicameralism and presentment, that would we think, likely render any sort of unilateral termination of our free trade agreement implementing acts to be unconstitutional. And of course, again, what about the market pushback and so forth? So we simply looked at those practical aspects, and our ultimate conclusion was, yes, we will see a more aggressive use of our traditional trade remedies, anti-dumping, countervailing duties, potential use of safeguards, maybe some Section 301 actions, but overall, not some of the scariest aspects of trade law that are buried in a lot of these old dusty statutes.
I want to turn to Gary, but let's stick for the moment with the potential of the more traditional, with the anti-dumping, CVDs, and Section 301. Now, just take 301. Again, I'm going by the senator's point and things I've read. It looks as if the president does. What are the limitations of him invoking Section 301, which is a more traditional?
Right. So Section 301 allows for the unilateral imposition of retaliatory measures in the face of foreign trade barriers, give or take. So fortunately, in the Statement of Administrative Action of the Uruguay Round Agreements Act, there's actually which is a part of U.S. law. It is codified into U.S. law and binding. It says quite plainly that following the United States implementation of the URAA as part of joining the World Trade Organization, Section 301 would only be used by USTR in instances that are not covered by our WTO agreement obligations. Now, this leaves some leeway. In my opinion, I think one area might be currency. Currency is not really covered in the WTO agreements, only briefly mentioned. There's actually a lot of history from the GATT in the 40s related to the negotiation of a future currency agreement that I think would give some leeway there. But it does provide a rather broad constraint on the use of Section 301 unilateralism without involving the WTO.
It would allow us, just as an example, though, clearly outside of the WTO, to take any kind of or a lot of action against, let's say, Chinese investment, since investment is not really covered. You could say there's an unfair trade practice.
Yeah.
And the other thing, I suppose, you could also play a lot more than you given credit to the administration to play games, even with things that are part of the WTO, which they would then stretch in a way of saying this is an unfair.
Yes, yeah, and I totally agree that I don't want to. Right, I don't want to sell that short. But I think that as this goes back to, again, kind of our view on the practical aspects. If the administration were going to start really testing the waters and testing the limits of its Section 301 authority, I think, again, you would trigger some pretty substantial pushback, not just from the markets, not just from the lawsuits, the WTO litigation, but I think also eventually from Congress.
I want to turn to Gary, but if I were in the White House and you really wanted to do it, I would say, so what? We know we'll have lawsuits, but that'll be down the road, and it's not likely you're going to have a big economic turmoil from
right. But if you look,
particularly if it's against China,
right?
Say.
And let me be clear. I don't want to be too calm about some of the potential risks we have. But at the same time, if you look at what's happened with immigration in the last few weeks, we've seen the courts exercise a rather rapid restraint on an area in which the president arguably has the most executive power of any. So there are these constraints out there. And it also gets to a broader political issue. Do we really think the Trump administration wants to go down a road of salting the political earth when it comes to achieving other potential gains, whether it be tax reform or maybe healthcare policy or infrastructure or so forth? So there also is this broader political context we have to consider.
Okay, I wanted to get Gary in on all this.
Well, I agree with basically most of what Scott said, but he's making Ralph over here too relaxed, and we've got to get Ralph awake again.
We want him agitated.
We're going to agitate him, and I'm going to agitate him right now. There's a decision coming up in April, so that's pretty quick, on the currency report. And as we all recall, campaigner Trump was going to name China a currency manipulator on his first day in office. He's not done that. He's passed the buck to Treasury Secretary Mnuchin, who's going to issue this report. Now, if you use the word manipulator in the same sense that the International Monetary Fund uses it, that is persistent one-way intervention to essentially make the currency more competitive, China isn't doing it. They're persistently one-way intervening to raise the currency to make it less competitive, keep it from falling. But, what the heck? What China is doing, whatever China is doing on the currency market, it still has a huge current account surplus with the world, about 400 billion, I think, and it has a big current account surplus with the United States, trade surplus, to use the vernacular, of about 300 billion. So, in the eyes of the Trump team, that's bad. So, what are they going to do in this report? Well, my guess is they're going to find a new word, misalignment, or possibly undervaluation. So we can have a little conflation between manipulation. They did that back then as a couple of years ago. Still misaligned thanks to what happened back then. It's a problem. So that's just a word. That's just a name. That doesn't do anything in terms of starting pulling the trigger. Here's the however. They may decide that what we need to do in response to that problem is to make the misalignment a subsidy for purposes of the CVD law. And if they decide that, then Claude's dark vision is really coming into view, because there are three ways they can do that. They can pull out of the dust box one of these old statutes and say, this is not covered by the WTO, we're going to 301, or we're going to go back to Section 262, or, IEPA. And we're going to say that what we need is a 8% tariff across the board on Chinese imports. That's the formula for a trade war right there.
Can
Go
ahead. I'm sorry.
Sorry,
Let
let me finish.
Excuse me.
Second way is they can tell, and Ross, or he'll tell himself, I'm going to rewrite the regulations. I'm going to make this misalignment a subsidy for purposes of the next CVD action. Now, I think that would be blown out by the courts, but it'd take a couple of years to do it. I don't see how I can rewrite the regulations, especially when we have the question about Chevron deference with Judge Gorsuch, perhaps to be Justice Gorsuch, raising that very pertinent issue, and rewrite these regs which have been there for a long time and have never had currency in them. But, what the heck, let's go ahead and do it, take a couple of years for the courts to correct. Or third, so that would be less than using one of these statutes, but it still is a big thing to add a CVD penalty to all, for currency to all cases that anybody might bring. And then the third, of course, would be to go to Congress and ask them to pass one of those CVD subsidy laws, which were considered a couple of years ago. So that would tend to affirm the darker vision.
And I want to go to you, but there are two things you were saying there. One, they would move just by executive action. The third would be go to Congress. How much authority do they have on their own to make these changes in CVD? Whoever wants to answer.
Right, and I think that it's interesting. I wouldn't consider the use of our trade remedy laws, anti-dumping, countervailing duty laws, even in a way to countervail currency, to be a dark side issue. I think I don't agree with it. I think that it would cause diplomatic headaches, WTO litigation, court litigation, the rest. But in terms of, compared to an across-the-board 35% tariff or even a 10% tariff, something like that, compared to a broad Section 301 action, compared to an action under any of these crazy other statutes we never used, this is small potatoes. Now, on your specific question, look, I think that the Department of Commerce actually, there's a good chance it could make a case for writing its regulations with respect to whether a countervailing, or with respect to currency undervaluation as a countervailable subsidy. Not to get into the weeds and bore everybody to death, but it really relates to defining what's a financial contribution, what's a benefit of that financial contribution, and is that contribution specific, or is it a prohibited export subsidy? That's our subsidy definition. So there are ways you can do it, and it has been argued in the past by petitioners' counsel that just so happen to now be populating the Trump administration in the trade space. So that's a possibility. But is that an all-out trade war? I don't think so. And I would just add, though, that in my opinion, I think the most shenanigans that are going to come about are going to come about in the trade remedies space. I would also look at not just currency and the CVD law, but I would look at the anti-dumping law. In particular, a little-known provision called particular market situation, which could allow the Trump administration to go after distortions in countries' economies through pervasive government intervention, and thus assign higher anti-dumping duties. And this, again, has problems in the free trade space and in the legal space, but it certainly isn't the all-out trade wars that we're worried about.
But if you did this, let's go back to the countervailing duty, and it clearly you do a series of actions against the Chinese. The Chinese, which covers a lot of their goods, they would count this as a trade war.
Well,
I don't know how they would not.
Let me interrupt here.
Go ahead.
I think it's a very important distinction. If the administration were to use one of these existing statutes, 301 or one of the others, to put an across-the-board tariff on China, even if it's fairly low, 5% to 10%, I think that's a trade war right there. I think the Chinese will retaliate.
right.
And I think that'll be big stuff, and I think it'll rattle the financial markets. So I think the Goldman Sachs crowd in the White House and Treasury would argue very strongly against that. But the nationalists may prevail. However, if the administration uses its alleged power to rewrite the regulations, then it depends on a case-specific bringing and arguing. And I think that's not the trade war, that's a trade remedy.
But then that depends on how widely they use that.
Well,
I mean,
but
do
you
they-
would-
what-
No,
But you would still need the International Trade Commission.
But a CVD requires that you have to first of all prove the margin, and then you have to go to the ITC. That takes a bit of time, and that's industry by industry.
And product by product, even.
Yeah,
I mean,
right.
so, of course, and I think that it would be inevitable that we would see Chinese retaliation similar to what happened when President Obama issued the tire safeguard back in 2009. So would we start seeing Chinese trade remedy cases pop up against politically sensitive American exports? Yes, but it would be on a discrete product-specific basis, and something that I don't think would, as Gary mentioned, rattle financial markets. Now, and again, I think the other important thing to note is if we operate in the trade remedy space, we're operating through a very significant web of U.S. law precedent. So we'd have to go to the International Trade Commission for all of these cases and find injury. We trade lawyers know quite well. The ITC is typically where you actually have a chance of winning. The cases, it's I think about 65% chance, 65% victory rate. So there's still a chance you could lose. And you need the statutory factors there, whether it be increased import volumes or price effects or the rest. So there are legal checks if they operate in the trade remedy space. Checks, by the way, that don't exist with respect to some of these dusty old laws that have no regulations or have never been used.
I want to talk more about the dusty old laws, but let's stay with I guess I would call it traditional. What about the prospect of let's say with Mexico, or as we go down the road with even the Japan FTA, of going back to the old VER, voluntary export restraints?
Oh,
That
yeah.
is where. Why would they not use that? What is the legal background? Can they do it? It's a very flexible instrument, as we found out under Reagan.
You mean other than the fact that they're prohibited under the WTO agreements?
Yeah, but I think they would figure that they could get that would be a long time down the road.
Oh yeah, we're going to see a steel VRA. I mean, as sure as the
Well,
sun,
that's my point.
as the sun rises in the east, you know, Lighthizer, a brilliant guy. He's a master at these things. He knows how to draft them, so forth, and all the mechanism is in place to have it. And you know, maybe it's somehow against the spirit of the WTO. But if nobody brings a complaint, where's the problem? About 10 countries, you're going to get them to limit their exports. That's going to be right there. And so, yes, unfortunately,
But there would likely also be, I mean, one of the first would be with Mexico, right? I mean, that's one of, with
yes.
automobiles.
Well, okay, but I'm talking
just
about
guessing.
steel now.
Go
For
ahead.
steel, yeah, steel gets limited first.
Okay, but that's a precedent. Once you
Oh,
do
yes,
that,
once you do that, then if you read this great document that came out this morning, we want, if you read the portion on rules of origin, it opens up the possibility for what I have said where the Trump administration will go. They not only want to raise the rule of origin on autos for NAFTA, which is now
Right.
62 and a half, get it up to 70, 75. But more importantly, they say we got to get more production in the U.S. And I think there might be a rule within the rule. Okay, now, if we don't get a rule within the rule, that is, a certain amount has to be produced in the United States, then we come to your suggestion. Maybe we get some kind of very loose VRA on autos. The companies all sign up that they're going to put their next factory in the U.S., that kind of thing. And might be with the companies, might be with Mexico, I don't know. I agree with you. The precedent will be there.
Scott, I want to move, but how strong is the WTO rule against VRAs?
I mean, I think it would be a pretty, if there is a VRA in place, I think it would be a pretty easy case. I mean, I don't think it would be difficult. They are, and not only in the WTO agreements, of course, but our trade agreements themselves also have rules barring these types of arrangements. So, look, you're right that a WTO case, to win it, would take 6 years, start to finish, before you'd see retaliation. So certainly they could gamble that. In my opinion, that doesn't strike me as a most likely avenue. I think there are other levers that they can pull that are far less obvious and far less problematic in terms of immediately ginning up disputes and litigation and the rest. I mean, personally, I think the procurement space is going to be ripe for more Buy American stuff, and as noted, that will likely breed or infect the rest of the world with buy local provisions on procurement. That's not good. And certainly, I think there's ample room for problems in trade remedies. And I think Section 301 is something we really are going to have to look at, especially because Bob Lighthizer loves Section 301. And then I think the other problem or issue we're going to see is whether we agree to comply with adverse WTO decisions, again, mainly on our trade remedies abuses. Right. That's an issue. But, I got to say, the thought of a very public VRA on steel involving 10 countries and so forth strikes me as, at this early stage, unlikely. But I can say that I always have to put in the caveat. We're only 2.5 months in. I need to see more before I make stronger predictions.
I want to turn to the audience in a minute, but I'd like to go back finally to these dusty old laws that and get down into the weeds with all of them, and we don't need to go through all that. But let's posit this. Let's say that they decide that they would like to use one of these dusty old laws. Which one is there any distinction among them that the administration might use? Is there a precedent? I mean, I'm just throwing this out because you guys know a lot more about this, but the 1977 law you declare has been used actually, so they could go back to something like that. But what other, obviously, again, we're in the weeds here, the trading with the enemy law from 1917, are you going to go back? But somebody actually used that at some point, I think, did they not?
Oh,
At
yeah.
any rate, assuming for the moment they were going to use one of these laws, is there a better one to use from their perspective of winning or getting?
Scott can have the final word on this, but if we look at what Nixon did when he imposed the 10% tariffs, at the time of the
Right.
Smithsonian. Well, he didn't do it. Well, he's a lawyer, but he got his lawyer. What they did, they layered in. They named the Trading with the Enemy Act. They named Section 262, which is the
So
60.
they just went across
And
the
they
board.
went, and so you can name 6 different laws in your executive action.
You figure
and-
one of them will be.
Well, and then what the court did in that particular case, which was litigated by some hapless Japanese firm, the lower court never was appealed, or maybe even appealed, but never taken up. It just said, oh, TWA covers it. He could do this. Even though the Trading with the Enemy Act talks about war and so forth, and where was the war? The war cited in this particular use of it in 1971 was the Korean War. Well, the Korean War was sometime earlier. I was a kid when we had the Korean War, and so how could this be supported by the courts? Well, what it shows is, I want to get back to a point Scott made earlier. On the whole, the courts have been extremely deferential whenever the president names emergency, national emergency, or national security. I realize this immigration case cuts the other way. I defy you to find a case in the trade space which cuts the other way. And we've had any number of use, about 70 cases of using TWA or IEPA for economic sanctions against obviously dangerous countries like Grenada and Panama. Well, nobody's even bothered to challenge it because it wouldn't get any place.
Scott, briefly, and then I'll.
Sure. So 2 things. One is, and I actually had done a little research on courts' deference in the national security space, even on trade. And there are a few cases out there where the courts have pushed back. And in fact, there was a recent one related to CFIUS. And now I'm a CFIUS investment, Chinese investment, that the courts were willing to consider. Now, the case ended up getting settled out, but there wasn't a blanket deference to the administration and to the government in the national security space and in the international economic space. So I do think there are limits. Now, I agree entirely. Those limits are way, way down the cart path. But there are, I think, some that we need to consider. Now, personally, if I were plotting diabolically, I would actually go back to something. I mean, I think the buffet strategy is very strong. But to choose an alternative, I would do something, look at Section 338, which has no precedent, almost, has no regulations. You could write them from scratch, and is such a broad and ambiguous grant of authority that you could do practically anything. Now, so that gives you the other option. So I don't, again, do I think that's going to happen? No. But if I were plotting, that'd be something I would take a very, very hard look at.
I'm sure the White House is listening right now.
They'll consult.
This isn't being recorded, so it's
yeah,
fine.
of course. Well, the NSA has got everything to do here anyway. So. All right, let's turn to the audience with some questions. Please identify yourself.
Thank you. Tim Bennett, Transatlantic Business Council. First, a comment and then a question. Gary, your comment about the trade liberalization has come to a stop. I disagree with that. The EU has consciously responded to what's happened here to accelerate their negotiating with a whole range of areas, the Japan FTA, Indonesia, Mercosur, et cetera, consciously in response, taking the global leadership. And then Mexico and the Pacific Alliance announcing the Chilean meeting. TPP, uncertain. We're going to now deepen the provisions and obligations of the Pacific Alliance, and then the other TPP signatories saying we're going to examine what we can do on that. So it has actually not stopped. And then the question, with the lack of even nominations at the sub-cabinet level at these key economic policy executive branch agencies, how much will that, I know, Scott, you and Claude both kind of touched on this a little bit, how much will that slow down anything actually occurring, say, in 2017?
Right. So we actually just issued a short report on the startling vacancies at USTR, at the Department of Commerce, at Treasury, and elsewhere. And again, going back to understanding the very rigorous process that is the actual formulation of a coherent U.S. trade policy, all the committees that it has to go through and all that are, I think, still in place. So I think you're right. We originally were saying, okay, we'll give it till late March, early April, and then we'll see something. Well, now I think you're right. I mean, I think now we're looking into the summer. Right. And that staffing, personnel is policy. And it's another reason why I'm very hesitant to make firm, strong predictions at this point, because we need to see the staff. We need to see where things progress. I agree.
They have agreed to, the whole decision, and I guess it was forced on them, that they will follow TPA rules in terms of, say, renegotiating NAFTA. And that puts them into a extended, even if they had personnel,
right,
an extended process.
And
but they could go forward with things like announcing that we are going to, this is our order of renegotiation. I mean, I could see them saying something, okay, Japan is next, even though they don't pull the trigger. They could give warnings of things that they want to do. That doesn't stop them from that sort of thing.
I'd like to
Go ahead.
pick up on what Tim said. He's right on the rhetoric, right, to push back that the EU-Pacific Alliance have said good things. I was in Jakarta just about a week and a half ago, and with a group of Asians who were talking about what to do in the wake of Trump, and they were very optimistic going forward with intra-ASEAN deals and RCEP and so forth. But on that, Tim, I'm going to join
The
Claude
dark side.
on the dark side, because I want to see the results. I mean, there's a lot of talk. I had hoped out of the Chile meeting of all the TPP countries, where China joined as an observer and Korea joined as observers. The U.S. actually sent somebody down, but he was kept out of the critical meeting. I had hoped out of that some countries would step up and say, yes, we not only ratify TPP, but we will apply it provisionally to other countries that ratify. That didn't happen. That did not happen. I want to see some beef, as Mondale said, but I like the rhetoric.
I want to swing away from the dark side on that. I'm still hoping, because they are going forward the TPP and ratifying what they had agreed. Whether they're applying it is another thing. And I think it depends on Japan in terms of getting forward with this. I certainly hope it. Makes a lot of sense for them. The Trump TPP nations could actually pull one on the Trump administration. If they could get their act together in the next year, they could say this is a bilateral at that point. But we don't have much time, so there's another question in the back.
Hi, Isabel Hoagland with Inside U.S. Trade. Thanks for a great discussion. I have a lot of questions, but I'm going to stick to one quick one. Do you think Senator Lee's bill will pass? And I would like to hear a little bit more about your thoughts on the timing of that and how it will impact the trade policy in the immediate future.
My guess is exactly what Senator Lee said, that it will take a clearly obnoxious action by the president to give this momentum.
I think he can hope that the president, one way or the other, puts a 35% tariff on Mexico. Yep. That would grab the attention of the Congress.
And I'm in general agreement, but I do think that first of all, if you look at the absence of co-sponsors, you can tell the complete political vacuum that's there right now for some sort of public support or public opposition to the president on trade. However, I think the bill remains valuable even if it just sits around, in that it's now a conscious, in case of emergency, break glass thing sitting on the wall of the U.S. government, and hopefully has caught the attention of somebody in the Trump administration to understand that, look, if they start down this dark side road, there are people already in Congress ready to act in response.
And the other thing to keep in mind, as I said in my question to the senator, was that there are some, I don't mean to put blame on that, this isn't a blame thing, but there are some there's some elements the Democratic Party would like to see the president move forward in terms of unilateral actions, and there are Trump supporters for whom this would be still very popular. I mean, that's the one thing we have to keep in mind in terms of Trump and what's happened in terms of other areas now. Is if he were to go independent, of traditional Republicans, let's say, and other things, that would be something that is very popular in the areas where, where he gained strength in the Middle West.
Yeah, although
As opposed to the healthcare where there's all this stuff where they're moving away. This could actually bring some people back, but we really don't know.
Yeah, although I do wonder whether a lot of Democratic politicians have had the luxury of taking anti-trade positions because they were operating in a space of a free trade consensus. I mean, if you look at the polling, Democrats now support free trade far more than Republicans. And so if we actually ended up in a crisis situation, I do wonder whether those politicians would be so willing to maintain their anti-trade
Bernie
positions.
Sanders went in
Well,
the
yes,
Congress.
that's certainly true.
Listen, I'm going to have to cut this off because it's 9:30. Thank you all very much for coming, and thank you. Please join me in congratulating our panel for a great set of analysis.
Thanks, Claude. Great, great.
That was good.